can still see it, as if it's frozen in time. The soft glow of candles inside the church. The sound of the organ playing low, solemn notes. My daughter Emily, only 23, lay in her casket surrounded by white lilies. My body felt hollow, like the grief had carved me out from the inside. And then he walked in. 15 years of silence, and suddenly James Cooper strolled down that aisle like he belonged there. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, the smug look in his eyes, it was as if he thought this was his stage. His moment. The whispers started immediately. People turned their heads. Some thought it was touching that Emily's father had come to say goodbye. But I knew better. I could see it in the way he carried himself. He wasn't here to mourn. He was here to claim. I sat frozen in that pew, my hands gripping the program until the paper tore at the edges. He had abandoned us when Emily was 8 years old, leaving her to cry at the window night after night, hoping her daddy would come back. And now, after years of silence, he dared to sit beside me at her funeral and act as if he had earned that right. What cut the deepest wasn't his presence, it was his audacity. He leaned close, just enough for me to hear, and started speaking of rights, of what he believed he was entitled to, now that Emily's company was worth $35 million? Imagine that. My daughter was still in her coffin, and he was already thinking of money. Outrage burned through the grief, like fire licking at dry wood. In that moment, I wasn't just a grieving mother, I was a protector. I knew this wasn't over. James hadn't returned for love or regret. He had come back because Emily had built something extraordinary without him, and he wanted a piece of it. And that's when the memories came rushing back the night he walked out of our lives and left me to raise Emily alone. When I think back to the night James walked out, it feels like a wound that never really closed. Emily was only 8 years old. She had been building a blanket fort in the living room. Her little face lit up by the glow of a flashlight as she invited me inside. For a tea party with her stuffed animals. She had no idea her world was about to change forever. That evening, James came home with a look I will never forget, cold, impatient. Already halfway gone. There were no apologies, no explanations that made sense. Just a man eager to shed the weight of responsibility. He said words that shattered everything we knew as a family. And then he packed a bag and left before Emily even had a chance to ask why. I remember watching her press her tiny hands against the front window, whispering that maybe Daddy had forgotten something and would come back for it. She waited there for hours, her breath fogging up the glass, her little body curled against the sill. When she finally turned to me, her eyes still full of hope. I didn't know how to explain that he wasn't coming back. How do you tell a child that her father has chosen someone else over her? In the weeks that followed, she asked less and less about him, until eventually, she stopped asking at all. That silence was worse than the questions. It was the silence of a child who had learned that love could disappear without warning. For me, survival became the only option. I took on 2 jobs, one during the day at the hospital and one in the evenings at a diner. My body ached, and there were nights I fell asleep in my uniform at the kitchen table. But I refused to let Emily see me break. I packed her lunches, ironed her school clothes, and stayed up late helping with her science projects, even when my eyes were barely open. There were moments of joy, too. Emily was bright, curious, and determined to shine despite the absence that loomed over her childhood. She loved computers, spending hours tinkering with an old laptop we'd rescued from a neighbor's garage sale. I remember the way her eyes would light up when she solved a problem, as if she'd just unlocked a secret code in the universe. But underneath all that brilliance, I could still see the scar her father left behind.
Birthdays came and went with no card, no phone call. Holidays passed in silence. I tried to make up for it with extra presents or special traditions. But no amount of wrapping paper could fill the empty chair at the table. Still, Emily grew stronger. She turned that pain into fuel, into determination. While James disappeared into another life, Emily began building hers with grit and brilliance. I often wondered if she was trying to prove to herself that she was worth loving, worth noticing. And she was. She always was. Looking back now, I see how those years of abandonment shaped her. They made her resilient, resourceful, and fiercely independent. She didn't just survive her father's absence, she transformed it into something powerful. That little girl who once sat at the window waiting for a man who never returned would one day become a young woman who created something extraordinary. And that is where her story truly began. Emily always had a spark that set her apart. Even as a little girl, she was drawn to puzzles and problems most people would overlook. While other kids were watching cartoons, she was at the kitchen table with that second-hand laptop, determined to make sense of lines of code she could barely pronounce. I used to smile watching her brow furrow in concentration, her small fingers tapping away as if she were holding the keys to some secret world. By the time she was 12, she wasn't just playing with computers, she was creating. She had built small programs that amazed her teachers, even helping her middle school librarian organize the book catalog. I remember one teacher pulling me aside and saying, "Linda, your daughter is going to change the world someday." I didn't know exactly how, but I believed it. That belief only grew as she got older. At 16, she built her first real application, a simple but clever program designed to protect patient records after she overheard me venting about problems at the hospital, where most teenagers were focused on dances or driving lessons. Emily was focused on making sure families didn't lose critical medical information when they needed it most. She saw how fragile life could be, and she wanted to fix it. Her vision became clearer in college. She dreamed of creating a system that made medical records completely secure, but still instantly accessible to the right people, anywhere in the world. She told me once that no one should ever lose care because of missing paperwork or system errors. I could see the fire in her eyes when she spoke about it. For her, it wasn't just a project. It was a mission born from her own pain of being left behind. She wanted no one else to feel forgotten. By 19, she had been accepted into a tech accelerator program. Investors saw what I had always known, that Emily wasn't just talented. She was revolutionary. 3 months later, she had the foundation of what would become her company, MedSecure, a system that hospitals across the country would later adopt. The growth was staggering. By the time she was 21, her software was being used in hospitals nationwide. At 22, international organizations were licensing it. And my baby girl was on the cover of magazines calling her a genius who was changing healthcare. Her net worth soared to $35 million before she was even old. Enough to rent a car without a co-signer. But it wasn't the money that defined her. Emily cried the day she made her first million, not from greed, but from the overwhelming responsibility of knowing she could make a difference. She told me she wanted her success to mean something, to protect the people who are too often overlooked. She carried the weight of that dream with grace far beyond her years. And then, just as the world was beginning to notice her brilliance, life threw a cruel twist. Emily was diagnosed with leukemia. My bright flame, my unstoppable force, suddenly found herself fighting not against business competition, but against her own body. Even then, she tried to stay strong for me. She would smile through the exhaustion, insisting that her company's mission was bigger than her illness. but I could see the toll it was taking.
Behind her determination, there was fear, and behind her fire,
there was fragility. I didn't know then that her story would end so soon. And I certainly didn't know that the man who had abandoned her would one day try to claim her legacy as his own. At the funeral, I could hardly stomach watching James play his part. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who believed charm could rewrite history. He shook hands, offered condolences, and spoke with tears in his voice that I knew were nothing but performance. He introduced himself to Emily's colleagues and business partners as if he had been a guiding presence in her life, as if he had earned the right to share in her story. I stood quietly, letting him perform. But inside, I was boiling. Every handshake, every sympathetic nod from those who didn't know the truth felt like an insult. To Emily's memory, they didn't know that this man had abandoned her when she was only 8, that every milestone in her life had happened without him. He wasn't a grieving father. He was an opportunist who had smelled money. And I was right. The very next morning, as I sat at my kitchen table still numb from the funeral, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw James standing on my porch, his polished shoes and pressed suit out of place against the peeling paint of my modest home. Beside him stood another man, carrying a leather briefcase. A lawyer. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I had to. They came in, sitting across from me in the living room where every surface was still, covered in photos of Emily. James glanced around, almost surprised that her face was everywhere, as though it was news to him, that she had been my whole world. The lawyer spoke first. He used calm, measured words, explaining that James had standing as Emily's father, that certain legal rights might entitle him to a portion of her estate. His voice was professional, but I could hear the hesitation in his tone. He didn't sound convinced. Something about the way he phrased it maintains he has parental rights sent a shiver down my spine. It was a careful choice of words, the kind lawyers use when they know their client's case isn't solid. I leaned back in my chair, studying James. He looked confident, but too confident. The way a man does when he's hiding something. That's when the cracks began to show. The lawyer asked me if I was aware of any documentation regarding James's parental status, court orders, modifications, anything of that nature. James stiffened. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the lawyer as if begging him not to push further. But the lawyer didn't back down. He pressed James to disclose everything. And then it became clear. Years ago, when I had struggled to get child support, James had made a choice. To avoid paying, he had legally terminated his parental rights. In black and white, in official documents, he had signed away the very thing he now claimed gave him access to Emily's fortune. For a moment, the room fell silent. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, realizing his client hadn't been honest. James tried to explain it away, talking about complicated circumstances. But I could see the sweat on his forehead. His mask of control was slipping. In that instant, I felt something I hadn't felt in days, a flicker of hope. Emily's legacy wasn't going to be stolen so easily. The man who had abandoned her had already given up the only claim he thought he still had. And as I sat there, staring at the man who once called himself her father, I couldn't help but wonder, had Emily known this day would come? Had she prepared for it in her own way? The answer, I would soon discover, was yes. After the lawyer's visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had known this was coming. My daughter was many things brilliant, compassionate, stubborn, but above all, she was prepared. Even in her illness, she thought 3 steps ahead of everyone else. That night, I found myself in her old room, surrounded by the pieces of her life. Her desk was still cluttered with notebooks full of sketches and code, sticky notes with ideas scribbled in her neat handwriting. As I opened her filing cabinet, I noticed a folder set apart, sealed with my name written on the front in her careful script. My heart trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, there were legal documents, neatly organized, and a letter addressed to me. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Emily's words spilled onto the page with the same clarity she had always carried in life. She wrote that she knew her father might one day return, not for love, not for reconciliation, but for money. She had seen it coming years ago, even before her diagnosis. She told me not to be afraid, because she had already put protections in place. She had worked with attorneys, hired investigators, and created a paper trail so strong that no one could ever question his abandonment. She reminded me of the day he walked out when she was 8 years old. And she wrote that she never forgot the lesson he taught her, that some people value money more than love, and that if he ever tried to crawl back into our lives, she wanted the truth to speak louder than his lies. I read those words through a blur of tears, my grief colliding with pride. My daughter, who should have been worrying about school dances and college classes, had been preparing to defend me and her own legacy from the man who left us. But that wasn't all. The folder contained evidence she had gathered on James. Photographs, financial records, even testimonies from other women he had used and discarded. She had quietly built a case that revealed a pattern. James hadn't just abandoned us. He had done the same to others. He wasn't just a bad father. He was a predator, moving from one opportunity to the next. Emily had turned her pain into armor. She wasn't content with just protecting herself. She wanted to ensure no other child had to feel the way she had felt. As I held that letter, I could almost hear her voice, calm and steady, reassuring me that I wasn't alone in this fight. She had thought of everything, down to the smallest detail, and she had trusted me to carry it forward. In that moment, I realized something powerful. James hadn't come back to steal Emily's legacy. He had walked straight into a trap she had set long before her death. And soon enough, he would learn that lesson the hard way. James didn't give up easily. Men like him rarely do. He came back to my door a week later, this time without the polished smile. His eyes were darker, his posture strained, like the weight of his lies had finally started pressing down on him. He wanted to talk, to negotiate, to find some middle ground where he could walk away with something. But there was no middle ground anymore. By then, Emily's preparations had already taken root. Her mentor, Victoria, and the estate attorney had gathered everything into a fortress of evidence. James' claim was already unraveling. The termination of his parental rights made his case legally impossible. But it didn't stop there. Emily had anticipated his next move, his arrogance, and she had built a counterattack that no amount of smooth talking could undo. When his new lawyer tried to argue that he had been pressured into signing away his rights, the documents were produced showing it was voluntary, witnessed, and legally binding. When he tried to claim that his absence was misunderstood, photographs and testimonies surfaced of the other families he had abandoned over the years. And then came the final blow. Among Emily's files was a separate folder, marked only with one word, justice. Inside were records of James' fraudulent activities, credit applications under false names, hidden bank accounts, even evidence of tax evasion. He hadn't just been running from responsibility as a father, he had been running from the law. I watched from across the room as his lawyer's face drained of color when the documents were laid on the table. There was no way to defend it. The man who had once stood so tall, convinced of his ability to talk his way through anything, suddenly looked small. And then, the moment I will never forget Emily's video. She had recorded it in her final weeks, her face pale, but her voice steady. She spoke directly to him, her words clear and deliberate. She told him she knew what he had done, not just to her, but to every family he had betrayed. She told him she had made sure the truth would follow him for the rest of his life. And then, she did what he had never been capable of. She left behind love. Even in her anger, she said she had built her fortune not to punish him, but to protect others. That his choices had defined him, but hers would define her legacy. James couldn't even look at the screen. He dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking not from grief, but from the crushing realization that he had been outmatched by his own daughter. It wasn't long before federal investigators got involved. The evidence Emily compiled was more than enough to open a case. Within months, James went from strutting into a funeral demanding millions to standing in a courtroom facing charges that could take away the rest of his freedom. For me, watching it unfold was painful but necessary. The man who had once promised to love us had spent years preying on others. And now he would finally face the consequences. But the story didn't end with his ruin. Emily had made sure of that. Her downfall for him was only the beginning of something greater. Her legacy was waiting, untouched by his greed, ready to shine. James's story ended in the way I think Emily always knew it would. The courts stripped away the last of his illusions. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and identity abuse. I sat in the gallery the day he was sentenced, and instead of anger, all I felt was a quiet emptiness. There was nothing left of the man I had once loved, only the consequences of his choices catching up to him. But Emily's story, her story still lives. The fortune James tried to claim became something far greater than wealth. Emily had left instructions that her money be used to create scholarships for children who had been abandoned, just like she once was. She funded counseling programs, mentorship opportunities, and advocacy groups for families struggling to rebuild after betrayal. Her foundation was built on the same compassion she carried throughout her life, turning her pain into protection for others. When I meet the students who receive her scholarships, I see the reflection of her spirit in their determination. When I hear from families who benefit from her programs, I feel her presence guiding me. Emily refused to let her father's abandonment define her worth, and in doing so, she gave hope to countless others. As for me, I carry her lessons every single day. Love is not about the promises we make, but the presence we keep. Money can be lost, stolen, or fought over. But the legacy of kindness and resilience outlasts everything. Emily turned her scars into something unbreakable. And though her time on this earth was far too short, her impact will continue for generations. If you're still listening, I want you to take this with you no matter what betrayal you've faced. You are more than what was taken from you. You can turn pain into purpose, just like Emily did. Thank you for spending this time with me, for keeping her story alive. If her journey touched you, I invite you to share your own story in the comments, subscribe, and help us continue building a space where voices like hers will never be silenced.